Most people hear the name Tupac and think of one man. They think of Tupac Shakur, the face of 1990s hip-hop, the voice of anger and clarity, a figure whose life ended early and froze him in time. His image is familiar, his words are endlessly quoted, his story feels complete, but the name itself is older than America. Long before Tupac Shakur ever recorded a verse, Tupac was already a dangerous word. It belonged to a man whose existence challenged empire, whose death was meant to erase a lineage, and whose memory refused to disappear. That man was Tupac Amaru. The choice to revive that name was not aesthetic, it was political. Afeni Shakur understood its weight. She understood that naming her son Tupac meant tying him to resistance. One Tupac confronted the power structures of modern America, policing, media, surveillance, incarceration. The other confronted the Spanish crown at the height of its imperial reach. They lived in different centuries and fought different systems. But the through line was the same, a refusal to accept a world built to keep certain people permanently subordinate. This story doesn't begin in Oakland, it begins in the Andes, before hip-hop or the United States. To understand the second Tupac, you have to understand the first, not as a symbol, but as a man who existed, ruled, resisted, and was destroyed in public. That's where this story actually starts. Chapter 2, Inside the System. The man later known as Tupac Amaru II did not grow up on the margins of colonial society. He was born José Gabriel Condorcanqui in the early 1700s, into a family that still carried recognized Inca nobility. Under Spanish rule, that status came with limits, but it also came with access. He was educated, spoke Spanish fluently, and operated as a merchant across large stretches of the Andes. He moved between indigenous communities and colonial officials with unusual ease. In the eyes of the Spanish administration, he was useful. That position gave him a clear view of how the system actually functioned. As he traveled, he saw how forced labor drafts emptied villages to supply silver mines. He saw how tax quotas were raised beyond what communities could survive. He saw how corregidores, local colonial officials, turned legal authority into personal extraction, using debt and punishment as routine tools. José Gabriel initially believed the system could be corrected. He assumed abuses were the result of bad actors rather than design. He used the channels available to someone of his standing, attempting to resolve grievances through colonial law. Nothing was ever done. What became clear over time was that his lineage gave him status, but it gave his people no protection. And even his status existed only at the crown's convenience. By the late 1770s, Spanish reforms made conditions worse, not better. New taxes targeted indigenous trade. Labor demands expanded. Traditional authorities were stripped of what little power they still held. The space for negotiation closed. It was during this period that José Gabriel adopted the name Tupac Amaru II. The name carried memory. It linked him directly to the last Inca ruler executed by the Spanish 2 centuries earlier. At this point, violence was not yet inevitable, but legitimacy had collapsed. Once the law revealed itself as a tool of extraction rather than justice, resistance became the only remaining option. In November 1780, that resistance stopped being theoretical. Chapter 3, The Spark That Lit the Andes. The rebellion began with an arrest. In November 1780, Tupac Amaru seized and detained Antonio Arriaga, the Spanish corregidor of Tinta, a local colonial official known for brutal enforcement of labor drafts and taxes. Arriaga expected deference. What he encountered instead was authority turning against him. Days later, Arriaga was executed in public. That moment shattered a long-standing illusion. For centuries, Spanish rule had survived on the belief that resistance was fragmented and impossible. The execution sent a different message. The empire could be challenged, openly, and by someone who understood its machinery. The response was immediate. Indigenous communities across southern Peru rallied to Tupac Amaru's call. Tens of thousands joined within weeks. Farmers, laborers, muleteers, local leaders, people who had lived under forced extraction for generations. What made the uprising dangerous was its structure. Tupac Amaru framed the rebellion carefully. He positioned the revolt as a corrective force against abusive officials, illegal labor practices, and colonial corruption. This gave the movement legitimacy in the eyes of those who might otherwise have hesitated. Spanish authorities were caught off guard. Colonial militias collapsed quickly. Supply routes were cut. Communication between cities broke down. The rebellion advanced toward Cusco, the former capital of the Inca Empire and a city heavy with symbolic power. For a brief moment, Spanish control in the Andes looked genuinely fragile, but the uprising had limits. The coalition holding it together was broad, not unified. Indigenous groups supported Tupac Amaru, but Creole elites, Spaniards born in the Americas, largely refused to align with him. Fear of indigenous rule outweighed resentment toward the crown. That hesitation mattered. As the rebellion grew, its demands radicalized. Calls to end forced labor hardened into calls to dismantle colonial authority entirely. The Spanish crown responded with scale, sending troops, resources, and reinforcements far beyond what local officials could muster. By early 1781, momentum shifted. The empire regrouped, the rebellion fractured, and Tupac Amaru was captured. What followed was a spectacle designed to extinguish memory. Tupac Amaru was captured in April 1781, betrayed after months of pursuit. Once in Spanish custody, the goal was erasure. He was taken to Cusco and subjected to interrogation alongside his wife, Micaela Bastidas, their children, and other leaders of the rebellion. The Spanish were not searching for information alone. They wanted submission, a public admission that the uprising had been illegitimate from the start. They did not get it. What followed was not a judicial proceeding in any modern sense. The outcome had already been decided. The crown wanted a demonstration powerful enough to discourage rebellion for generations. On May 18, 1781, Tupac Amaru was brought into Cusco's main square. Thousands were forced to watch. Before his execution, he was made to witness the deaths of his closest allies. His wife was executed in front of him after resisting to the end. His son was killed shortly after. The sequence was intentional. The message was clear. Resistance would not just cost a life, it would consume entire families. The Spanish then attempted to execute Tupac Amaru by drawing and quartering him. Horses were tied to his limbs and driven in opposite directions. It failed. His body did not come apart. Only after repeated attempts did the executioners resort to decapitation. His body was dismembered, and the parts were sent to different regions of the Andes to be displayed publicly. Warnings nailed to posts and town gates. The Spanish believed terror could do what force alone could not. They were wrong. The brutality did not extinguish the rebellion, it inflamed it. Uprisings continued across Peru and into present-day Bolivia for years. Other leaders took up the name Tupac Amaru. Some were crushed. Others inspired movements that would resurface decades later. The crown understood the mistake almost immediately. The name Tupac Amaru was banned. Speaking it publicly became a crime. Inca symbols were outlawed. Indigenous clothing associated with the old empire was prohibited. These were not the actions of a confident empire. They were the actions of one that understood it had nearly lost control and might lose it again. Tupac Amaru was dead, but the idea he represented had escaped. Chapter 5: The Name That Refused to Die. The Spanish crown did everything it could to bury Tupac Amaru's legacy. For decades, even invoking him was treated as sedition. The goal was not just to stop rebellion, but to make resistance feel isolated, accidental, and doomed. It didn't work. The name survived quietly, passed through oral history, indigenous memory, and suppressed education. It became shorthand for something larger than the man himself. The idea that empire could be confronted even if it ultimately crushed you for trying. When independence movements swept Latin America in the 19th century, Tupac Amaru was no longer a criminal. He was recast as a precursor, proof that resistance had existed long before liberal revolutions gave it new language. 2 centuries later, the name crossed continents. In 1971, Afeni Shakur named her son Tupac Shakur. This was not historical trivia. Afeni was a political organizer, a member of the Black Panther Party, and a woman deeply aware of how power names its enemies. She chose Tupac Amaru because the story resonated. A system built on extraction, law used as control, rebellion framed as criminality, and punishment designed to be public and exemplary. Tupac Shakur grew up carrying that inheritance. Whether consciously or not, his music returned to the same tensions: surveillance, incarceration, police violence, structural poverty. filtered through a different century and a different empire. Like his namesake, he was articulate, confrontational, and impossible to absorb safely into the system he criticized. Like his namesake, he was alternately celebrated and feared. And like his namesake, his death did not resolve the discomfort he created. That is the through line. Tupac Amaru challenged the Spanish Empire and was executed to make an example. Tupac Shakur challenged American power structures and was consumed by a culture that profited from his image while recoiling from his message. Neither man won in the way revolutions are supposed to win. Both succeeded in a different way. They made it impossible to pretend the system was neutral. That's why the name keeps resurfacing. Not because it promises victory, but because it reminds people what resistance costs. And centuries later, empires still react to it with fear.